to this, the sixth session of the study of the book of Genesis. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about the big picture, what we can expect to find in the rest of the book of Genesis. At the end of the last session, we talked about some recurring themes found in Genesis. Today we're going to discuss some more higher level themes. But primarily we're going to begin to hear the stories of Abram. In these stories we'll learn much more about the character and personality of Abram than we did in any of the individuals in the primeval history. We'll begin reading chapter 12 through 16 today. Abram goes to Canaan, he builds an altar, then almost immediately heads for Egypt, where he crosses paths with Pharaoh. Later he raises an army and becomes a military leader. God offers a covenant in today's narratives. So we also learn about God, his expectations, his strength, and his goodness, and his faithfulness. But before all that, let's begin with a prayer. O God, our Father, open our eyes and enlighten our minds as we study your word. So grant that our minds may know your truth, and our hearts may feel your love, and then confirm and strengthen our wills, that we may go out to live what we have learned. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So chapter 12 begins the second unit, the Patriarchal Tales. And we're going to see some major themes in the Patriarchal Tales that we didn't see last week. We're going to talk about a few of those. The first one is order and meaning in history. We see a stylized or patterned chronology in the Patriarchal Tales, even more so than what we saw earlier. There's a reliance on certain round numbers. We saw some of that, but we'll see more of that, like 3 and 7 and 40. It suggested that human events are not random but planned events. The second is blessing. God bestows his blessing on his creatures, and especially on the fathers and mothers of Israel. Covenant. God concludes agreements with human beings. We saw a covenant with Noah a couple of weeks ago, and there will be several more. Frequently we'll see covenants with God. God punishes evil doing. God is provoked by anger of human failure. We saw that with Adam and Eve and with the world before the flood, and we'll see it again. Testing. God tests those who are to carry forth his mission. The result is the development of moral character in these human beings that are doing his work. There's an undercurrent in Genesis that points not to life in its continuation, but to its threatened extinction. The stress and continuity and discontinuity has one purpose: to prove God is in control of history. There's a dramatic high point of Genesis we'll see in chapter 22 in a couple of weeks. The binding of Isaac, when the entire enterprise of Genesis hangs in the balance. The main characters emerge less as victors than as survivors. There's one major tension not resolved at the end of the book of Genesis: God's promise of the land of Canaan. The children of Israel are in Egypt and own only a burial site in Canaan when the book ends. The hero tradition. In the ancient world, the hero is often a lonely figure who must overcome death and obstacles. It is a little different here. In the Bible, death is overcome by individual struggles and through the covenant community bound together by God's laws and his promises. Two more things about the changes we're going to see. As the book progresses, there is a tendency for the style of literature to become smoother. We see in Abram, a much more rounded figure than we saw with Adam or Cain or Noah. But Abram still doesn't seem quite human yet. The fragmentary nature of material in the primeval history and the short stories about Abram in the Patriarchal Tales will give way to greater coherence and concentration later on. And finally, a relatively flowing psychological complete narrative when we get to the Joseph stories. Contact with God becomes less and less direct as Genesis moves on. God has conversations with Adam and Noah and with Abram. Joseph never has a conversation with God. So now we begin with chapter 12, and I'm reading from Robert Alter's translations today. We start with verse 1 through 3, chapter 12, verse 1 through 3. And the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your land and your birthplace and your father's house to the land I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and those who damn you I will curse. And all the clans of the earth through you shall be blessed. Abram was just a name and a genealogy, has now become an individual character. Abram is addressed by God, but he himself at this point has said nothing. He doesn't say anything for a while. Pay attention to how long it is before Abram actually speaks. Try to remember when that is. God doesn't tell Abram where he is going, just like in chapter 22 when he tells Abram to take his son up the mountain to make a sacrifice. He doesn't tell him where he's going or what he's doing. There's a triplet here, leaving your land, your birthplace, your father's house. It's important. All these things that Abram is leaving to go where God is sending him, and even though he doesn't know where that is yet. There's also a balanced formula with blessings and curses in verse 3. It's almost poetic. You shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and those who damn you I will curse. But he goes on, and all the clans of the earth through you shall be blessed. This is not a minor addition. We'll talk more about it later, but for now, God has promised Abram, that he will be a blessing to all the families of the earth. A humongous responsibility. So remember this promise. Let's go on to verse 4 through 9. And Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went forth with him. And Abram being 75 years old when he left Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his nephew, and all the goods they had gotten, and the folk they had bought in Haran. And they set out on their way to the land of Canaan, and they came to a land of Canaan. And Abram crossed through the land to the site of Shechem, to the terebinth of Morah. And the Canaanite was in the land. And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your seed I will give this land. And he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. And he pulled up his stakes from there for the high country east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, with Bethel to the west and Ai to the east. And he built there also an altar to the Lord, and he invoked the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed onward by stages to the Negeb. So Abram was clearly a wealthy man to start with. His father was obviously a wealthy man as well. Verse 5 tells us Abram is bringing slaves with him. He took Sarai and Lot and all the goods they had gotten and all the folk they had bought in Haran. The Negeb, where Abram ends up, is a desert south of Jerusalem and Beersheba and southeast of the Dead Sea. It's south of what we normally think of as Judah, so he's gone pretty far south. Genesis 12:10 through 16. And there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grave in the land. And it happened as he drew near to the border of Egypt that he said to Sarai his wife, look, I know you are a beautiful woman. And so when the Egyptians see you and say, she is my wife, they will kill me, while you they will let live. Say, please, that you are my sister, so that it will go well with me on your account, and I shall stay alive because of you. And it happened when Abram came into Egypt that the Egyptians saw the woman was very beautiful. And Pharaoh's courtiers saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And it went well with Abram on her account. And he had sheep and cattle and donkeys and male and female slaves and she-asses and camels. So the sister-wife scenario that we see here, this occurs 3 times in the book of Genesis. It's here, chapter 20 and chapter 26. Abram goes into Egypt because of a famine. It won't be the last time this Genesis story takes us to Egypt. And Abraham's stories were not written in a vacuum. The writers knew the story was to come later in Genesis and Exodus as well. The scenario was clearly a foreshadowing of the later famine when Jacob's sons went down to Egypt in time of famine. Abram telling Sarai, they will let you live, foreshadows the baby Moses segment in Exodus, that every boy that is born you shall fling into the Nile, and every girl you shall not live. Verse 17 through 20, the end of the chapter here. And the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his household with terrible plagues because of Sarai, the wife of Abram. And Pharaoh summoned Abram and said, What is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her to me as wife? Now here is your wife, take her and get out. And Pharaoh appointed men over him, that they sent him out with his wife and all he had. So here we have the plagues foreshadowing the plagues in Egypt in Exodus. Pharaoh kicks Abram out of town, just as later in Exodus another Pharaoh has had enough of Moses and his plagues and kicks him and all the children of Israel out of Egypt. Let's go on to chapter 13, verse 1 through 4. Abram came up from Egypt, and he and his wife and all he had, and Lot together with him to the Negeb. And Abram was heavily laden with cattle and silver and gold, and he went on by stages from Negeb up to Bethel, to the place where his tent had been before, and between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar he had made the first time, and Abram invoked there the name of the Lord. So Abram and his nephew and Sarai go back to the desert of the Negeb, which is, again, north of Egypt. And as he travels on by stages up north to Bethel. Bethel is, again, north of Jerusalem, northwest of Jericho. 5 through 7. And Lot too, who came along with Abram, had flocks and herds and tents, and the land could not support their dwelling together, for their substance was great, and they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's flocks and the herdsmen of Lot's flocks. The Canaanite and the Perizzite were then dwelling in the land. So they can't afford divisiveness when they are surrounded by potential enemies, who would be the Canaanites and the Perizzites. But there's some irony here too, in that they're dividing up the land that already has inhabitants. No evidence that they asked the Canaanites and the Perizzites about where they should go or how they should divide this land up. It wasn't their land as far as the Canaanites and Perizzites was concerned anyway. So 8 through 12. And Abram said to Lot, Pray, let there be no contention between you and me, between your herdsmen and mine, for we are kinsmen. Is not all the land before you? Pray, let us part company. If you take the left hand, then I shall go right. If you take the right hand, then I shall go left. And Lot raised his eyes and saw the whole plain of the Jordan, saw that all of it was well watered, before the Lord's destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, till you come to Zoar. And Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan. And Lot journeyed eastward, and they parted from one another. Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain. And he set up his tent near Sodom. So, this is the second time we hear Abram speak. Do you remember the first time? First time was entering Egypt, speaking to Sarai. Both times he's concerned about his own survival. Here Abram is clear and firm and polite, less frightened and more reasonable and logical than he was then. Lot is going to become an urbanite, living near a town, a city, unlike Abram, who stays in the wilderness. Not sure exactly where Sodom and Gomorrah were supposed to be, except they were near the Jordan River, possibly on the east side of the river, but I don't know. The maps I've seen show a lot of different places. So I'm going to go on to read Genesis 13 through 18. Now the people of Sodom were very evil offenders against the Lord. So right here there may be a suggestion, just guessing, that Lot has probably made a bad choice. Let me go on. And the Lord had said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, Raise your eyes and look out from the place where you are to the north, and to the south, and to the east, and the west, and for all the land you see to you, and I will give it to you, to your seed forever, and I will make your seed like the dust of the earth. Could a man count the dust of the earth? So too your seed might be counted. Rise, walk about the land, and its length and its breadth for to you I will give it. And Abram took up his tent and came to dwell by the 10 berths of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and he built there an altar to the Lord. So Abram has this spectacular view from the heights. He's up in the mountains between Bethel and Ai, and Lot, by contrast, is down in the sunken plain, down by the river. Walking around the perimeter of the property was a common legal ritual in the ancient Near East for taking final possession. Abraham would have had a very long walk. The Lord had outlined a very large area that he said, this is your property. And to walk around that would have taken him a while. He eventually settled in Hebron, which means he went south again from Bethel, about 35 or 40 miles. Hebron is south of Jerusalem near the Dead Sea. Bethel is north of the Dead Sea. And Negev is even farther south. So, chapter 14. And it happened in the days of Abram, king of Shinar. Now, there's something it tells you here when it says, and it happened in the days of. It signals a major shift in narrative style. All of a sudden, we are talking about a regional war here. So this is a very different story, a very different thing than what we've been talking about in the past. So 1 through 7. And it happened in the days of Amphiril, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elazar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and the title king of Goilim. They made war on Bera, king of Sodom, and Bersha, king of Gomorrah, and Shinab, king of Adamah, and Shimber, king of Zobium, and the king of Bela, that is Zor, and all of them joined forces in the valley of Sidon, that is the Dead Sea. 12 years they had been subject to Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they had rebelled, and in the 14th year Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and struck down Raphim at Ashtaroth Karanium, and Zumim at Ham, and the Imim at Sheveth Kirisim, and the Horite in the high country of Serah as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness. And they swung back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and then they struck the territories of the Amalekite and also the Amorite who dwelt in the Hazeron Tamat. So it's a lot of kings doing this battle. So we can remember Shinar from chapter 11, where all the people gathered to build the tower. Shinar is Babylon. So when they talk about the king of Shinar, we're talking about Babylon at this point. Babylon from Babel. The chapter is likely from a different literary source from the three principal sources of Genesis that we've talked about so far, the J, the P, and also the E. We haven't seen anything from the E yet. It doesn't really fit as well with the story as, and was probably added at a later time, but it was probably based on a very old story that just was fitted in. Abram, having been promised national tenure in the land, is now placed at the center of a narrative that makes him a figure on the international historical scene. Notice where in verse 2 it says, and the king of Bela, that is Zor. In verse 3 it says, all of them joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is the Dead Sea. This is an indicator that this is an ancient story, either oral or written, but the common names for these places had changed before this current version was written. The story, as remembered, uses Bela and Valley of Siddim, but now, as of the time this was written, they were called Zor and the Dead Sea. This could have been done by the individual who originally put the story in writing or by the final redactor who collected the stories and put them in the form we know today as the book of Genesis. Don't know which one what that was. So let's go on with verse 8 through 12. And the king of Sodom, and the king of Gomorrah, and the king of Adamah, and the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zor, went forth and joined battle with them in the valley of Siddim, and with Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and the title king of Golim, and the Amphiril king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar, 4 kings against the 5. And the valley of Sidon was riddled with bitumen pits. And the king of Sodom and Gomorrah fled there and leapt into them, while the rest fled to the high country. And the 4 kings took all the substance of Sodom and Gomorrah and all the food, and went off. And they took Lot, Abram's nephew, and all his substance, and went off, for he was then dwelling in Sodom. So finally we hear what all this has to do with Abram. As we suspected, Lot apparently made a poor choice in picking Sodom as his new home, and it's come home to haunt him already. But now we have to introduce Abram into the problem. And a fugitive, this is, we'll go through 16, 13 through 16. And a fugitive came and told Abram the Hebrew, for he was then encamped in the tenebrous of Mamre, the Amorite, the kinsman of Eshcol and Aner, who were Abram's confederates. And Abram heard that his kinsman was taken captive, and he marshaled his retainers, natives of his household, 318 of them, and gave chase up to Dan. And he and his servants with him fanned out against them by night, and he struck them and pursued them up to Hobah, which is north of Damascus. And he brought back all the substance, and also Lot his kinsman, and his substance he brought back, and the women and the other people as well. So, verse 13 is the only place in the Hebrew Bible where Abram is referred to as Abram the Hebrew. Verse 14 says Abram gave chase up to Dan, which is in far north Canaan, and then went much farther up north past Damascus. It's interesting in that Dan is named after one of Abram's great-grandsons. After the Exodus from Egypt, Dan was one of the 12 tribes of Israel. The writer or redactor is simply describing the territory so that his readers would know how far north Abram pursued the enemies. It does not necessarily imply that Abram knew the name of the territory as Dan. Let's go on with 17 through 20. And the kings of Sodom went forth to meet him, and after he came back from striking down Chedorlaomer, and the kings that were with him to the valley of Shaveth, that is the valley of the king, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, for he was a priest to Elliott, and blessed him. And he said, Blessed be Abram to Elliott, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be Elliott, who delivered your foes into your hand. Melchizedek means righteous king. Abram was blessed by Melchizedek. Salem is probably Jerusalem. In Psalms, Zion is used interchangeably with Salem, so Zion is consistently identified with Jerusalem. So Melchizedek is probably the priest king of Jerusalem. Elliott, remember we talked about the names of God early on, the first session I think it was. El and Elyon are both considered the name of God. Elyon together is the sky god in Canaan, but it could also mean God Most High in the Hebrew. Abram uses the same phrase in verse 22, which clearly refers to God, to Abram's God in the Hebrew sense. So we'll go ahead and read 21 through 24. And Abram gave him a tithe of everything, and the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the folk and the substance, and take for yourself. Abram said to the king of Sodom, I raise my hand in oath to the Lord, the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will take not a single thread or sandal strap of all that is yours, lest you say, I have made Abram rich. Nothing for me but what the lads have consumed. And as for the share of the men who come with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take their share. So lads here refers to the fighters that Abram had recruited, that he says let them take their share of what they've already consumed. They had a right to the spoils of their conquest, and here it does not refer to the members of Abram's household, his servants and herdsmen. They were not going to take anything. While Abram, as a great military leader, seems a little bit out of place here, the emphasis here is not on the battle itself, but Abram's magnanimity after the battle and disinterestedness. He was primarily concerned with maintaining fair and proper relations with the people of the land, the local kings. Chapter 15, I'll read verse 1 through 6. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. And Abram said, O my master Lord, what can you give me when I am going to my end childless? And the steward of my household is Eliezer. And Abram said, Look, to me you have given no seed, and here a member of my household is to be my heir. And now the word of the Lord came to him, saying, This one will not be your heir, but he who issues from your loins will be your heir. And he took him outside, and he said, Look up into the heavens and count the stars, if you can count them. And he said, So shall be your seed. And he trusted in the Lord, and he reckoned it to his merit. The word of the Lord came. This is a formula for revelation characteristic of the books of the prophets. Not so much in the Patriarchal Tales, but here we have it. The night vision that we have here is also a prophetic mode, not common in the book of Genesis. This is also Abraham's first actual dialogue with God. Here we finally begin to see evidence of a human dimension to Abraham. He argues with God. God promises Abraham progeny, and they haven't seen any evidence of that yet. So what's the deal here? So we go on 7 through 11. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees to give you this land to inherit. And he said, O my master Lord, how shall I know that I shall inherit it? And he said to him, Take me a 3-year-old heifer and a 3-year-old she-goat and a 3-year-old ram and a turtle dove and a young pigeon. And he took all of these and clove them through the middle, and each set his part opposite the other, but the birds he did not cleave. And the carrion birds came down on the carcasses, and Abram drove them off. Strange ceremony here. So this covenant is not part of the nocturnal vision that we just completed, but this cleaving of the animals is in part of a mutually binding pact concluding at sunset. The pact is such that if either party violates the agreement, his body will be like the cloven animals. How that works, we don't know, but that's what the pact tells us. Verse 12 through 16. And the sun was about to set. A deep slumber fell upon Abram, and now a great dark dread came falling upon him. And he said to Abram, Know well that your seed shall be strangers in the land not theirs, and they shall be enslaved and afflicted 400 years. But upon the nation for whom they slave I will bring judgment, and afterward they shall come forth with great substance. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in ripe old age. And in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. Here God includes the prospect of enslavement in Egypt before the full realization of the promise. Things are going to be good, but not right away for a couple 400 years before it's going to actually work out so well. 17 through 21. Just as the sun had set, there was a thick gloom, and look, a smoking brazier and a flaming torch that passed between those parts. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your seed I have given this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river of Euphrates, the Kenite and the Kisnit, and the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Pezerite and the Rephaim and the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Gizurite and the Jebusite. He's expanded that territory. We've gone all the way down to the river of Egypt, which would be the Nile, all the way up to the Euphrates. Much larger area territory than what we had just a few chapters ago. The part about the somewhat mystifying smoking brazier and a flaming torch, not sure what exactly that means. The promise becomes larger, though, and more definite and more implausible to Abram. Chapter 16. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian slave girl named Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, Look, pray the Lord has kept me from bearing children. Pray come to bed with my slave girl. Perhaps I shall be built up through her. And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai, and Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian slave girl, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and she gave her to Abram, her husband, as wife. This is Sarai's first reported speech, and it's a complaint about her childlessness, her barrenness. Sarai did not invent surrogate maternity. It was not uncommon in the Near East. This is just the first time we read about it in Genesis. So 16:4. And he came to bed with Hagar, and she conceived, and she saw that she had conceived, and her mistress seemed slight in her eyes. Her mistress seemed slight in her eyes. Think this might indicate a problem? So 16 verses 5 through 10. And Sarai said to Abram, This outrage against me is because of you. I myself put the slave girl in your embrace, and when she saw she had conceived, I became slight in her eyes. Let the Lord judge between you and me. And Abram said to Sarai, Look, your slave girl is in your hands. Do to her whatever you think right. And Sarai harassed her, and she fled from her. And the Lord's messenger found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave girl of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? And she said, From Sarai, my mistress, I am fleeing. And the Lord's messenger said to her, Return to your mistress and suffer abuse at her hand. And the Lord's messenger said to her, I will surely multiply your seed, and it will be beyond all counting. So Hagar is in the Negev desert, heading south toward Egypt. The messenger found her by the spring on the way to Shur. Shur means wall, so this could be the wall on the northern border of Egypt. This is the first occurrence of an angel, the Lord's messenger in Genesis. The messenger begins as looking like an angel, but notice by verse 13 it sounds like God himself. We don't really know what Hebrews 3,000 years ago thought angels looked like. Did they have wings, halos? Did they look like people? Friedman suggested that these messengers are entities split off from God, and there's no clear-cut distinction between God and the angel. Let's go on to 11 through 16. And the Lord's messenger said to her, Look, you have conceived and will bear a son, and you will call his name Ishmael, for the Lord has heeded your suffering. And he will be a wild ass of a man, his hands against all, the hand of all against him. He will encamp in despite of all his kin. And she called the name of the Lord who had addressed her El Roi, for she said, Did I not go on seeing here after he saw me? Therefore it is well called Bir Laha Roya, which is between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore a son to Abram. And Abram called his son, whom Hagar had borne, Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So we have the repetition of this promise to Hagar. Ishmael means God has heard. El Roya means God who sees me. So we have God who has seen, the messenger has seen Hagar. There's some somewhat cryptic meaning in here that may relate to the belief that anyone who sees God directly will not survive. And yet here Hagar is still alive. So this ends chapter 16. We're going to stop here for today. We've seen Abram, an increasingly wealthy and powerful man with whom God makes a covenant, but whose wife cannot give him a son. So he goes to his wife's slave girl, Hagar. God makes promises to Hagar too, and she has a son, Ishmael. But let's go back to the third verse of chapter 12. You shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and those who damn you I will curse, and all the clans of the earth through you shall be blessed. When things went awry after the first 10 generations and God wanted to destroy humankind, he chose the family of one virtuous man, Noah. But as it turns out, choosing one virtuous man does not guarantee that that man's descendants will be virtuous as well. So another 10 generations goes by, and God realizes that it hasn't worked. He selects another virtuous man, Abram. God leaves the human species alive, but chooses an individual who will produce a family that will be a blessing to all the families of the earth. God repeats the blessing he gave to Abram back in chapter 12 4 more times during the course of the book of Genesis. This is important to God. The choice of this one man, Abraham, is supposed to produce some good for all humankind. This adds significance to every story that will follow in the Torah. When Abram moves to Canaan, it is a first step in a process that will bring benefit to all the earth. When he travels to Egypt, this is the first in a series of encounters that he and his descendants will have with the people of the world. When he separates himself from Lot, this is the first step, distinguishing his destiny from that of his brothers. Another step occurs when he joins among the kings in battle to save Lot and is brought into world events. His son Ishmael, who is also the son of an Egyptian slave girl, will be the father of the Ishmaelites, among Israel's related neighbors. Abraham's descendants are not to live by themselves or only for themselves. The Jews are a community that connects its birth with a promise, an obligation, a destiny to be a blessing to all. Next week, chapters 17 through 19, we continue with the story of Abraham. God continues to make these absurd promises, and Abraham continues to smile and nod his head and go on just as if he believes them. We will have the hospitality story where the 3 men appear at Abraham's tent, and we'll find Abraham pleading with God not to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And finally, we will hear the story of Lot and his wife and 2 daughters as they flee the city. Until then, be safe. Hope to see you Wednesday.